Let's continue talking about lists by talking about list methods. So remember, if you have any questions, use that question and comment box. All right, so let's get started. Here's what we'll talk about in this module. We'll first talk about creating lists with the split method. Then we'll talk about joining lists with the join method. Then we'll just do a look at several list methods, including the append method, the count method, the pop method, and others. Then we'll do a lab. So first, let's create methods with the lists with the split. So Python provides a nice method that essentially takes a string and breaks it into pieces. So the syntax is the string, whatever your string is, dot split. And the argument is the separator. What is it that we're separating the string? What are we breaking the string on? And then max split is the maximum number of splits. And if we provide that, we can limit how many pieces we break from the string. Otherwise, by default, we break them all. So let's look at an example here. So here S is assigned life of Brian, and we split. Now by default, splits on white space characters. So this looks at life, sees a space, splits out the life part into an element of a list. Then it looks at OF, sees another space, breaks out of into another element, and then we see Brian. So by default, splits on white space characters. Here we'll create a record. The record is some number, colon, string, colon, another string, colon, and so on. And then we split on the colon character. So this finds all the items in this string that are separated by the colons and splits them out. So we see 1259 is the 0th element, John Doe is the next, 123 Main Street period is the next, then Chicago, Illinois, 60601. So here we see an example of record.split using the optional second argument. The optional second argument means, in this case, only split out 2 items. So we're going to split on the colon, but just give me the first 2. So here we have 1259, that's the first one. John Doe's the next one. And then we have the remainder unsplit. So the first thing this program does is it prompts the user to enter some input, and that will be names separated by spaces. So that's stored in name string. Then we'll take name string and we'll split it. And by default, split splits on the space characters. So whatever things are separated by spaces, those are split out and stored in names. So what names will be is a list of all the names that were space separated. So now we'll hit our familiar while loop, which will loop through the list names. So we start I at 0 while I is less than the length of names. Then we'll print element space concatenated with, and we'll take I, which is our index, which is an integer, convert it to a string, which is necessary when we're doing string concatenation. And when we'll concatenate that with a plus sign, and then we'll index within names to grab the element of the names list, and then make sure we increment I each time. So now when I run this, I'll enter some names. How about John, Paul, George, Ringo, some famous musicians. And I see element 0 is John, 1 is Paul, 2 is George, 3 is Ringo. So the idea here is that the split function takes this string of white space separated names and breaks them into a list. So what split does is it takes a string and produces a list. The opposite of that, take a list, produce a string, that's done with a join method. So let's look at join. The join basically, here I take a list, names, and that's John, Paul, George, Ringo. And then I'm going to create a delimiter, or the thing that will be separating the items. That'll be double equals. I take that delimiter, double equals, use it to join the items and names. So this will take a list, names, produce a string with the items of the list separated by that delimiter double equals. So I would see John double equals, Paul double equals, George double equals, Ringo. So split takes a string, produces a list. Join takes a list, produces a string. So that value of that string here, the double equals, is placed between the items. Now we could have used a string literal instead of a variable. So here we're taking the literal vertical bar and using it to join the names. So we would see John vertical bar, Paul vertical bar, George vertical bar, Ringo. Now what happens if we try to access a list beyond its length? this is going to produce an error. So here we create nums, 2, 4, 6, 8. So nums of 3 is the last item, 8. And what happens if I try to look at num sub 4? I get this output. This is an error. This is what's known as an exception. And the exception type is shown right here, index error. We're trying to access this list outside of its range. And so in Python, if you try to access a list beyond its bounds, you get that error. We can add elements to the list, but it's not done by assigning to an element that doesn't exist. So in this case, here names is John, Paul, George. And name sub 2, of course, is George. So what if I just want to assign name sub 3 Ringo? Now there is no name sub 3 originally. So when I try to assign it, I get this index error, trying to access a list beyond its bounds. So then the question is, how do I add items? The answer, append or extend, which we'll talk about. A bunch of list methods are provided. Count. This counts the number of items in the list. So if I say names.count, tells me how many elements are in the list names. Append allows me to add a single item to the right-hand side of the list. Extend allows me to add a list to the end of a list. Index locates an element in the list. Insert will insert an element anywhere in the list. Pop will remove an item from the list. That means it will physically remove and return it. And remove will remove an item with a particular value from a list. That's a very nice method to have. Reverse reverses the list, just reverses its order. And sort will sort it. So first count. So here nums is assigned 2, 4, 2, 9, 10, 2, 5, 5, 8. Let's count the number of times 2 occurs in the list. Let's see, 1, 2, 3 times. Now by the way, if I just said nums.count with no argument, it counts the number of items in the list. So here flags is true, false, true, true, false, true. How many times does true occur in flags? 4 times. So counts items in the list. Append adds a single element to the end. So here we assign nums 2, 4, 6, 8. And then here we'll do an append of 10, which will actually add to nums. So the append method modifies the list by adding the element to the right-hand side. Here it's added here. All right, let's look at an example program. What it will do is it'll loop through standard input. And as it's reading through standard in, it will build up a list. And it'll build the list up using the append function. And then we'll display the list. So let's look at append.py. So the first thing we do is we start our list of names as empty list. So we'll loop while true, which means forever or until we break. We'll prompt the user, enter a name to add, or simply the enter key to quit. So if we enter nothing, that's when we'll quit. Store that in name. So then we check, if not name, that means if name is the empty string, we'll break out. Otherwise, we'll take our list of names, append that string. So what the append function does is it takes a list, adds an element on the right-hand side of the list. So then we will print you entered and then the list of names. So let's run this. So I'll enter John, Paul, George, Ringo. Now what's happening here is we keep appending these names to list of names. Now eventually I'm going to hit enter to quit, so I'll do that now. So I'll hit enter. And then it shows the list that it created by appending all those names. Let's look at the next list method, extend. Extend is like append, but we can add a list instead of a single item. So here we start nums as 2, 4, 6, 8, and we'll extend nums by adding 10 and 12. So notice that here we're adding a list to nums, and we see that list 10, 12 added to the right-hand side. Here strings is for and then score. So let's extend strings with and 7 years. So the result, 4 score and 7 years. And let's extend strings with test, and we see test. Whoa, what happened here? That's interesting. You know what happened? Test is treated as an iterable thing, which is a list of characters. So we take this list of characters, add them to the right-hand side of the strings. All right, let's look at the next method, index. Index will locate an element in the list and return its index. So here I have nums, which is a bunch of zeros and ones. This says go into nums find the first occurrence of the element 1, return back the index. So let's see, it's 0, 1, 2, 3. So the first occurrence of 1 is at index 3, so this returns a 3. This says, look at the first occurrence of the element 0. The next argument is start looking at this index. So it begins looking at index 3, which is right here, tries to find a 0. Here it is, index 4. Now in this case, we say go into nums, look for a 1, start at index 5. Let's see, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's right here. And don't look past index 9. So it's going to try to find a 1. There it is right there, index 6. Here we go into nums, try to locate a 1. Start at index 0, but don't go past index 2. So it looks here, 0, then 1, then 2. Didn't find a 1, so we get a value error. So basically we get an exception come back. So let's insert. So we basically insert at some index some item. So it's kind of like an append, but let's look at this example, insert.py. So we start nums as the list 2, 4, 6, 8. So we'll print it before, and we'll see what the value is. So let me go ahead and run that. So it prints before nums is 2, 4, 6, 8. Then it prompts for the index. So I'm going to select an index, and then an integer to add to the list. And then we'll do nums.insert. So the insert takes 2 arguments, the index at which we want to insert, and then the value to insert. Now this is assuming an integer is being entered. That's what we've requested. So this tells me at what index, what value. So I'm going to say at index 1, enter 10. Now recall that index 0 here, that's the leftmost, that's 2. Index 1 is 4. So what's going to happen is it's going to add the 10 right where the 4 is. So it sort of pushes 4, 6, 8 to the right, inserts 10. The result is 2, 10, 4, 6, 8. Okay, our next method is pop. Pop removes an item from a list. So if we start colors with red, white, blue, purple, and then we do colors.pop, by default it removes the last item. So notice that purple is the last item. It gets returned back. So colors.pop removes the item, returns it back. And then if we look at colors, we see sure enough, there's no more purple in there. So if we do colors.pop1, this is going to remove the first item, white. So we see white removed, and sure enough, white has been removed from the list. So pop physically removes the item and returns it back. And by default, removes the rightmost item. Remove is similar, but it removes the first occurrence of whatever we're looking for. So here we assign names John, Paul, Pete, George, and we say names.remove Pete. So it goes in here, locates Pete, removes it, and we see the result, no more Pete. Then if we do an append of Ringo, we see Ringo, like we saw earlier, is added to the right-hand side of the list. Let's reverse the list. So here names is assigned John, Paul, George, Ringo, so we do names, there it is. Then if we do names.reverse, what this does is it takes the list names, modifies it by reversing the items. So if the original was John, Paul, George, Ringo, we reverse those, we get Ringo, George, Paul, John. Sort is similar. It will sort a list in place, which means it modifies the list. So we start names with John, Paul, George, Ringo, and then we sort it. So names.sort means take names, modify it by arranging the items in names in sorted order. So here we see George, John, Paul, Ringo, and that comes out in sorted order. So the input to this lab can be found in lab6.dat. So we see there's a number 3, and then some lines with words or items colon separated. So the first line is the number of lines that follow. So 3 means there's 3 more lines. The remaining lines are these items colon separated. Here's what I want you to do. Read the first line, determine how many lines follow. Then reading each of the following lines, create a list of all the foods in that line. So basically we're going to create a list of all the foods, then print the list, sort it, and then print it. So in our example we just saw before, we're going to execute it like this. We'll execute .lab6.py, redirect lab6.dat into standard in, and then we'll basically collect all the items into a single list, print it, sort that list, print that list sorted. There's an optional. Create the list eggs, bacon, hot dog, chili, waffles, and salad. And then for each item in this list, determine if the item is in the list of foods that we created in the first part of the lab. If so, determine at which index it exists, and the output should look something like this. So yes, eggs is in our list, it's at index 0. No, bacon is not in our list, and so on. So let's look at the solution to lab 6. So lab 6, we're first going to create a list called foods. Then we are going to do a raw input here with no argument. Now what that means is it's not going to prompt the user. It's just going to read in from standard input. And this makes complete sense to us because we're reading from that lab6.dat file. So there's no reason to prompt the user, just read it in. So that reads in the number of lines from the file. Then we'll loop that number of lines, reading the line. Again, no need to prompt here. We'll split the line on the column, and then we will do foods.extend. So when we split produces a list. Extend means take that list and add it to the right of my list foods. So it'll take all the items that were created in that list and then extend food with those items. Then we'll print the original list, foods. Then we'll sort it and then print the sorted list. So let's run this. So I'll execute lab6.py. Now remember, we have to redirect lab6.dat. So it shows the original list, spam, eggs, ham, and so on, and then it's sorted. All right, remember, if you have any questions, use that question and comment box. Thanks for your time for this module, and I'll see you in the next module.